So a couple of years ago, when we had first moved here to Mound Ridge and started serving West Zion, we were really making an effort to get out and meet folks in our congregation. And we set up a time to go and visit Randy, and we didn't know where she lived. The snow started to fall, right? It was this thick snow. It wasn't exactly that cold, but it was a little bit of a blizzard. And so me and Lisi and little Elijah, we set out. And we started walking down the street through this snow. We couldn't see where we were going. And we were walking along, and we didn't have a GPS or anything. We were trying to follow along in our map, and we're trying to look at like the address. We're like, it ought to be over here somewhere. We went up the hill. And then through the snow, we started to hear a voice, Brad, Lisi, over here. And we looked around through the snow. We couldn't see very well at all. And we looked around, Brad, Lisi, down here. And we see Randy standing outside of her house waving to us and realized she was just like a half a block from our house. And we had gone all the way up the hill and got totally turned around. But we couldn't see. We heard her, over here, over here. We found our way to her. Well, I'm thinking about that, because it's a little bit like today, except it was much snowier that day. I'm thinking about that because here we are in the season of Advent. In this time when we are called to refocus on Jesus and to listen for the voice of Jesus through the fog and the snow and the storm and the darkness of this present age, which honestly can seem like a lot sometimes. And there can be so much that clouds our vision and that keeps us from finding our way to the kingdom. But Jesus keeps calling us to seek him during Advent. Jesus is saying, hey, over here. Now let me set the scene for you. For this passage that we read from the Gospel of Matthew. It's Matthew 11. And John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, he had criticized King Herod Antipas, who was one of the sons of Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the one who had rebuilt the temple. He was also the one who had done a lot of not great things and tried to kill the infant Jesus and in the process murdered all those innocent babies in Bethlehem. And Herod Antipas had inherited 1/4 of his father's kingdom and also his father's ruthlessness. And when John the Baptist took Herod Antipas to task for his affair with Herodias, who was the wife of Herod's brother Philip, Herod had John arrested and thrown into prison. And you know how this story is going to go. Later on, Herodias' daughter Salome will dance before the king, and her reward will be to not ask for the half of the kingdom or mountains of gold, but for the holy head of John the Baptist on a platter. And sickeningly enough, she will get her wish. That's in Matthew 14. But at the moment, in Matthew 11, John the Baptist is alive, though not well, for he languishes in chains in Herod's dungeon. And apparently, he is at least able to see his disciples. He has the disciples, and they come to see him, and they give him reports about his cousin Jesus, what he's been up to. And so when John hears these reports about Jesus, a light bulb goes off in his head, and he thinks to himself, maybe this is the one. Maybe Jesus is the Messiah that we've been waiting for. Could it be that everything I'd been preparing for, the way I'd been preparing, could it be that was for Jesus? And so John sends his disciples to ask. Verse 3 says, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? And I want to focus on Jesus' response, because if you look at Jesus' response, I think there's a lot that he says there that helps us kind of refocus on him during this Advent season. Just look at how he responds right there when they ask him that question, are you the one? And Jesus' response, it's part of his pattern. It's part of his teaching, the way he teaches. Jesus doesn't just lay it straight out. He uses a question, and we often see Jesus using questions as a way to draw others into the mystery of his life and his mission. He puts the question at another point to his disciples. He says, well, who do you say that I am? And Jesus asks, when they try to corner him about paying taxes to Caesar, Jesus says, well, whose head is on this coin? When the rich young ruler comes to him and says, what must I do to be saved? Jesus says, well, what do you read in the scriptures, right? So Jesus often uses questions as his teaching method because questions force the other person to think. Questions make that other person look at their own assumptions and their heart and their way of understanding the world. And so When John the Baptist's disciples asked Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another? Should we expect someone else?" Jesus puts the question back to them, and he says in verse 4, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see," right? In other words, well, you tell me, what do you see here? You go tell him what you see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. And Jesus is not being evasive, right? Like he doesn't just say yes or no. He's not being evasive when he does that. It's not like, a politician on camera when, folks try to ask them a question and they change the subject and guide it back to their usual campaign slogans. I mean, it's not like that. Jesus is simply saying this: well, look at the evidence. Look at what's going on and tell me if that lines up, everything that you see, tell me if that lines up with what you understand is supposed to happen at the coming of the Messiah. And Jesus' answer, it really goes all the way back to the prophet Isaiah, the passage that we heard from chapter 35, because Isaiah had prophesied 500 years earlier, and he had said that there's going to be this highway to Zion, and Zion is this kind of an image of what Jerusalem looks like when God inhabits it. It's this image of the people of God. He says the highway to Zion, it's going to be like this. The eyes of the blind will be opened. The ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer. The mute tongue shout for joy. So Isaiah's vision, it's this way. It's this people movement. It's these folks who are approaching God's holiness and finding their joy and their peace and their healing and their redemption. That's the highway to Zion. And that's the highway that is being opened up through Jesus, which is no wonder that in the book of Acts, one of the names that the first believers gave to the church, this Jesus movement, they called it the way, right? It's this movement towards God. It's this movement with Jesus, the way, the highway to Zion. And there was this expectation that all of these phenomena, the blind are gaining sight, the deaf regaining their hearing, lame people getting up and walking in, the mute speaking, there was this expectation that these things will happen at the coming of the Messiah. That's what we see in the ancient prophets. And Jesus just puts that expectation to the test. He says, do you see these things in my ministry? Do the blind see? Well, yes. In Matthew 9:29, 2 blind men come to Jesus and he touches their eyes and their sight was instantly restored. And right after that episode, Jesus casts a demon out of a mute person and the man begins to speak. Or in Mark chapter 7, they bring Jesus a deaf man and Jesus sticks his fingers in his ears, actually spits on his fingers and sticks them in the guy's ears. And then the man hears again. And then Matthew 8, a man with leprosy comes to him and says, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." And Jesus does make him clean. And even though this wasn't on Isaiah's list of signs of the kingdom, Jesus goes one further. And he says that the dead will be raised. We see that. Matthew 9, he raised Jairus' daughter. He says she's not dead, she's just sleeping. Luke 7, Jesus encounters a funeral procession. And he reaches out and he touches the dead man who's being carried along on the funeral bier. And the man returns to life and sits up and starts talking. Or John 11, where Lazarus dies, Jesus goes and says, "Lazarus, come out." So Jesus has even raised the dead, and the poor have good news preached to them. Well, he's done that in spades. Just look at the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor, or blessed are the poor in the spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He's got this ministry that is aimed squarely at the outcasts and people who are disregarded, folks on the margins. And so Jesus' answer to John's disciples is this: just look at the evidence. I have fulfilled the expectations of the prophets and my own ministry, and even gone further. And Jesus' way of answering says something about how we find our way through the fog. I mean, what does it mean to follow Jesus? Is it just blind faith? Are we just staking our belief on something that cannot be proved? And I love it. I love it that Jesus didn't just say yes, right? He doesn't just say, well, yes, and believe it because I say so. No, what Jesus says is, well, what do you see? Right? They ask a question, And Jesus answers with an implicit question. And I think there is something to that, right? And I think especially in the season of Advent, the question of how do we find ourselves, how do we find our way through the fog, through the storm, through the snow, through whatever, how do we find our way to Jesus? Well, I think the first thing that we got to do is what John the Baptist did, what his disciples did, and what Jesus turned it around and did for them. And I think we got to ask questions. And we can get the idea that true faith should equate with certainty. That if we really believe, if we really place our trust in God, that we shouldn't be asking questions. We can get that idea. But I think that questions can be a part of faith. That questions can be an expression, in fact, of faithfulness, of faith seeking understanding. And maybe Advent is a time to lay some of those big questions that we carry at Jesus' feet, right? Lord, why did this happen? Why did my loved one die? What are you up to? What are you doing in my life? Maybe we can lay some of those at his feet, and he's big enough to handle all of those questions. But I think more than that, Advent is a time to ask questions about who Jesus is, what his life is about, what his ministry means to you. And I think in that way, the questions are an invitation, saying, Jesus, teach me more about yourself. Jesus, lead me to love you more deeply and to follow you more truly. Jesus, who are you? Because Advent's at the end of our calendar year, though technically it's the beginning of the Christian year. And it can be a time for us to look back through the swirl of our lives in the last year and to ask questions like, Jesus, where are you leading me to learn about you and to learn about myself in this last year? Because, those are faithful questions. Those are questions that focus us not on doubt, but on Jesus. Those are questions that have the potential to cut through the fog and to lead us more deeply into relationship with Jesus. During Advent, we seek Jesus by asking questions. And so too, we seek Jesus by watching for the signs of the kingdom. Now, if look for the places where the kingdom is breaking in. Look for places of renewed sight and hearing, of new life, of good news to folks on the margins. And so too, don't get distracted by the other visions of where the meaning of history will be found. So Jesus himself, there in verses 7 and 9, he says, as they were leaving, John's disciples were leaving, he says to the crowd, what did you go out into the desert to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in king's palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. People of power, those whom Jesus describes as wearing soft robes, living in palaces, they're going to always try to hack our attention and absorb our interest. That's the power of celebrity. The TV will blare, 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 pouring forth news, 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 and it will always risk becoming the focus of our lives, that we'll start to look at world power and money power and political power and believe that is the true center of history, that is what matters most in the end, that is what's really real. But Jesus is saying, what'd you come out to see? Yes, that stuff's out there. Yes, it's true. There are powerful people wearing soft robes in palaces. Yes, that's going to be what it's going to be. But Jesus says, look, the very fact of your presence here in the wilderness tells me that you are looking for something more. That's not the whole story. And part of what Advent helps us do is to tune out those alternative voices, or at least to turn them down and then tune back in to the kingdom. Because you see, one of the ways that we can get lost in the fog is by getting consumed by the news of the day. And here's Jesus telling us, make the one thing the one thing. Don't let your mind go down the black hole of the palace news. Focus on the kingdom news. Seek me, says Jesus. Listen, I read the news, right? I subscribe to a news magazine. I get up in the morning and I like to get on the internet and check what's going on in the world. But then that's it. I set that aside and I don't look at that again until evening. I read scripture, I do my work, I spend time in prayer, I sit with you all in your living rooms and wherever. And I guess you could call that a little fast from the news during the day. It's not very rigorous or anything. But it's something that I do so that I can keep the one thing in my life. Because I know that if I keep logging in to check the news, that is going to be what occupies my mind. That the latest tweet from the president, or the latest political back and forth, or the latest movie, whatever it is, that's what's going to kind of absorb my attention. And I want to pay proper attention to what's going on, but I don't want those things to be what define my life and drive my thinking. I don't want my life to be lived as a reaction to what someone else is doing and saying. I want my life to be lived authentically to itself, a life centered and guided by Christ. And so here's the question. Where are you seeing, instead of that palace power, those things that can distract us, the alternative is to ask, where are you seeing the signs of the kingdom, which are ultimately signs of Jesus? So think about your life in the last week or in the last month or even in the last year. Where are you seeing signs of the kingdom? Where are lives being changed, hearts renewed, relationships being restored? Those are signs of the kingdom. Where is new life breaking forth? Where is healing happening? Where is death being conquered? Those are kingdom signs. That's where Jesus is showing up. And pay attention to that, right? Notice those things. Those are clues to what Jesus is up to and where he's at. And we seek Jesus by watching for those signs of the kingdom. And the thing is that the signs of the kingdom, they're always going to be so much quieter than the soft-robed signs of the palace. They're not going to blare and vie for our attention. They're going to enter into our lives quietly, which is to say that we're going to have to reevaluate what's important to be able to see those signs. And I think that's the third piece of this. Jesus says in verse 11, I tell you the truth, among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist, yet he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. John the Baptist, he straddles two eras. He's the last of the prophets of the old covenant, and yet he's the forerunner of the new, which is why that Jesus says that he is the least in the kingdom of heaven, but the least, there's nobody that's greater than John, yet anyone who is in the kingdom of heaven, the least of them, is greater than he. Because anyone who finds their identity and life in Christ already possesses immeasurably more than even the prophets of the old covenant, and that includes John the Baptist. But it won't always look like what we might expect, because the kingdom will enter our world at a slant. So it's going to come into our world as John the Baptist wearing camel skin in the wilderness. It's going to be a young, unmarried virgin saying yes to God's calling. It's going to be Joseph refusing to bow to shame culture, instead take Mary as his wife. It's going to be magi from afar who do not belong to the covenant people of God by birth, but who go at great risk to seek and discover the newborn king. It's people right here, right now, standing up for what's right, speaking what's true, reaching out to folks at the margins. It's folks who have their lives illuminated by the light of Christ from within. And those are signs of the kingdom. And they're happening all around us. And most of the time, they're just not going to make it into the news, and we might not notice them at all. Think of what the headlines would be if the signs of the kingdom did make it into the news, right? Just think about those headlines. Man cares for aged father. Breaking news. Woman prays with hurting friend. Click here. Next up in tonight's news, church makes donation to help family in need. Think about if those were the headlines. And they aren't, right? They enter into our world quietly. But in the end, what all of this is to say is that no matter how we can get disoriented in the fog or the storm or the blizzard of life, however we can get disoriented, during this season of Advent, we are called to refocus on Jesus. We keep following Jesus. Last week I talked about listening for Jesus. Well, this week I'm talking about seeing him. Right? So Advent's a season of coming and celebrating Jesus coming into the world, but it's also a season of getting ready for his coming hearing and seeing him, paying attention to what matters most. It's about preparing our hearts, sharpening our senses, getting our minds focused so that we can see and hear and receive anew that baby in the manger. And he's, of course, the ultimate sign of God's upside down kingdom, of the God who comes, in the words of Audrey Assad, a singer, he comes like a winter snow, quiet and soft and slow, falling from the sky in the night to the earth below. Amen.